أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Verily, our praise is due to Allah. Praise Him. We seek His aid and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions. In whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. In whomsoever Allah leaves astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We testify there is no deity worthy of worship except for Allah, who is alone, no partnership, never has and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, brothers and sisters, friends and family, everybody tuning into the live stream, everybody joining us for the Zoom meeting and the discussion, which we highly encourage everyone to join us for. So thank you for joining us for the Sunday discussion and the book reading of When the Moon Split, which is a biography of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. That's compiled by Safiur, Rahman, Mubarakpuri. Last week we had gotten into the details of the Battle of Badr, the actions of which had happened, and now we're following up with what happens after the events of Badr. Alhamdulillah. So let's continue from there. So the events after Badr. So the victory Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted the Muslims at Badr deeply grieved the pagans. Revenge was upmost on their minds, and to this end they devised plans to inflict heavy losses on the Muslims. And as events show us, Allah, however, turned the tables on the Quraysh and blessed the Muslims with further triumphs and even more prestige. Just 1 week after the return from Badr, or after 2.5 or 3 months, according to some sources, Banu Sulaym began conscripting an army to invade Medina. And in a preemptive strike, the Muslims raided their bases and came back with booty. And then Umayr bin Wahab Jumahi and Safwan bin Umayyah decided to assassinate the Prophet. So Umayr stole into Medina, hoping to carry out his mission, but was apprehended as soon as he had entered Medina. Allah had revealed Umayr's motives to the Prophet ﷺ, who in turn disclosed Umayr's secret plan to him, and Umayr repented and embraced Islam. So next, the expedition against Banu Kainuka, if I pronounced that correctly. Even though the victory at Badr was decisive, it did not spell a reprieve for the Muslims. In fact, each tribe among the pagans and the Jews took it upon itself to keep up the pressure by harassing the Muslim state. The Jews of Banu Kainuka engaged in openly hostile acts, and when the Prophet ﷺ called on them to refrain, they retorted aggressively, "Do not delude yourself, Muhammad. Just because some naive fools and simpletons have entered your fold, should you ever fight against us, you will test our mettle as men of valor." And the Prophet ﷺ responded with his customary patience, which brought forth even more provocation from the Jewish tribes. And Banu Koinuka started a clash in the marketplace, which resulted in the death of a Muslim and a Jew. And this time, the Prophet ﷺ dealt with them firmly. He ordered the Muslims to besiege the enemy, and it was a Saturday, the middle of Shawwal, the second year after the Hijrah. After holding out a fortnight, Banu Kainuka laid down their arms in the night of the new moon of Dhul Qadha, and the Prophet ﷺ expelled them, driving them towards the Athrat in Syria, where most of them died shortly afterwards. So next was the expedition of Sawiq. Meanwhile, Abu Sufyan was still smarting over the defeat at Badr. He thirsted for another military encounter, one which he felt sure would go their way, and swore that he would not bathe until he had fought with Muhammad again. Weird. But with an army of 200 men, he came to Medina, seeking to acquit himself of his oath. And intent on spreading destruction, they raided a settlement named Arid, and they hacked and burned a number of precious date trees and got away after killing 2 of the Ansar. And when the Prophet ﷺ received news of the raiders, he and his followers went out in pursuit, and Abu Sufyan and his men succeeded in eluding the Prophet ﷺ, who pursued them until Harkarat al-Qaidar. In trying to get away swiftly, the Quraysh were forced to get rid of most of their valuable provisions, especially the cornmeal or sawiq, from which the expedition got its name. And next, Ka'ab bin Ashraf was killed. The next thorn in the Muslim side was Ka'ab bin Ashraf, an extremely wealthy Jewish poet whose enmity for the Muslims and the Prophet ﷺ was unrelenting. Ka'ab would use his considerable poetic talent to compose and recite derogatory verses against the Prophet ﷺ, his companions, and the honor of Muslim women, which he eulogized their sworn enemies and incited them to fight the Muslims. And immediately after the Battle of Badr, he traveled to Mecca to stir up these passions. And to an already bloodthirsty and enraged Quraysh, he orated at length, bidding them to extract vengeance for their defeat. And Ka'ab was a still skilled demagogue, and given the high esteem poetry and poets had in the Arab society, his words worked a spell on the Quraysh, and his call for revenge was welcome, as was his assurance that the Quraysh were in a higher spiritual plane than the Muslims, and he exhorted them to learn a lesson from what had happened with Banu Qaynuqa. And the Quraysh were a willing audience, and they swore to act on Ka'ab's advice. Having wound up his propaganda campaign against the Muslims, Ka'ab returned to Medina to continue his subversive acts against the Muslim state. And when the Prophet ﷺ heard about Ka'ab's return to Medina, he said to his companions, Ka'ab bin Ashraf has offended Allah and his messenger, ﷺ, who will rid me of him. And in response to the Prophet ﷺ's call, Muhammad bin Muslimah, Ubad bin Bashir, Abu Naila, Harith bin Aus, and Abu Abs bin volunteered their volunteered their services. Muhammad bin Muslimah was appointed the head of the mission and accordingly thought of a plan, but since it involved subterfuge, he sought the Prophet ﷺ's consent before putting his plan into action. And having received the Prophet ﷺ's permission to entrap Ka'ab, Muhammad bin Muslimah went to Ka'ab, and after Ka'ab's initial wariness had worn off, Muhammad confided that this man, indicating that the Prophet ﷺ came to us asking for charity, but he has put us to great trouble. So Muhammad bin Muslimah's word had the desired effects. Ka'ab exclaimed with joy, by God, you people will tire of him even more in the future. And now that Muhammad had gained Ka'ab's confidence, he requested a loan of wheat or dates, leaving his weapon as collateral, and his request was granted. So next came Abu Naila's with a similar complaint. He confided that some of his companions held the same unfavorable opinion of the Prophet ﷺ, and that he would bring them to Ka'ab as they were also in need of Ka'ab's help. And Ka'ab graciously agreed to meet them at a later date, delighted at finding more and more disenchanted Muslims through whom he could hurt the Prophet ﷺ. And it was the 14th of Rabi al-Awwal, the third year after the Hijrah, and the full moon was shining down on Ka'ab as he lay with his new wife in his fortress. And when the 5 armed Muslims came out to him, Ka'ab readily went down to see them, disregarding his wife's pleas to take care. He was so complacent about his success in finding collaborators that even the sight of the Muslim weapons did not startle him. He certainly did not see himself as their target. So they set out on a stroll, and Abu Naila's complimented Ka'ab about his perfume and also asked permission to smell his head. And flattered Ka'ab obliged. And Abu Naila sniffed Ka'ab's head and then, holding Ka'ab's head in his hand, bade his companion smell the fragrance as well. He asked to do so again and was allowed to smell the fragrance once more. And when Ka'ab's head was seized in his grasp, Abu Naila's urged his comrades, seize this enemy of Allah. And instantly the others struck with their swords, but with no success. And finally, Muhammad bin Muslimah used his axe to strike Ka'ab's abdomen. And as the axe cleaved his body, Ka'ab died screaming horribly, and the sound of the disturbance roused Ka'ab's men, who lit torches around the top of the fort, but they did not find the 5 men who got away, having silenced their most vocal enemy at last. So Ka'ab's death greatly demoralized the Jews, and in their newfound sense of discretion, they decided against open warfare upon the Muslims and went underground, and the Muslims were safe for a while from this harassment. So the Sariya of Qurda in Jamad al-Awwal, the 3rd year after the Hijrah, the Quraysh sent a trade caravan to Syria by way of Iraq, and they entrusted the caravan to Safwan bin Umayyah, and were not overly concerned at the risk involved since the route went through Najd, far from Medina, and the menace of the Muslims. And when the Prophet ﷺ came to know about the Qurayshi caravan with his precious cargo, he dispatched a cavalry of 200 men under the command of Zayd bin Haritha. And at Najd, the caravan halted at a spring named Korda, and Zayd and his men swooped down on the caravan and its travelers. And even though the men managed to flee, their possessions fell into the hands of the Muslims, as did the caravan guide, Furat bin Hayyan, and the humane treatment Furat experienced at the hands of his captors so impressed him that he eventually became Muslim. And when the booty from the caravan was evaluated, its worth stood at 100,000 dirhams, and with this raid, the Muslims had inflicted on the Quraysh an economic defeat as devastating as the military one at Badr. So next we go into another pinnacle part of Muslim history, which is the Battle of Uhud. So now that the Quraysh had two humiliating episodes to live down, the Badr and Qarda were bitter losses, and it was time to channel all their anger and hatred into a military strike against the Muslims. And preparations began at a furious pace as the Quraysh launched a recruitment drive and admitted voluntary soldiers and anyone with a personal grudge against the Muslims, especially those who had lost fathers, sons, or brothers at Badr. So bards were brought in to incite the people with their songs of vengeance. Subsidiary tribes who owed allegiance to the Quraysh were also made to join the army, and women went with them to boost their morale and prevent them from taking flight. And the Quraysh ultimately mustered an army of 3,000 soldiers and 300 camels, 200 horses, and 700 coats of mail. And Abu Sufyan was the commander-in-chief of the Meccan army, and the valiant fighters of Banu Abdul Dar were appointed its standard bearers. And the proud and fearsome Meccan army advanced towards Medina on Friday, the 6th of Shawwal, third year after the Hijrah. They reached the outskirts of the city and camped in an open field in the valley of Qana, below Mounts Ainain and Uhud. So the Prophet ﷺ had been expecting the enemy for a week. He had already set up a patrol system around Medina to ensure the city's safety and had declared a state of emergency. And when the Meccan army had arrived, the Prophet ﷺ sought the counsel of his companions regarding further defensive measures. And this plan was to remain in the city with the men facing the enemy at the entrance of lanes and alleys and the women attacking from the rooftops of their houses. And when the plan was outlined before the community, the hypocrites among them, those who had become Muslim as a matter of convenience, were happy not to be out on the battlefield. Their leader, Abdullah bin Ubay, supported the plan since he could then sit safely at his home without being accused of falling back from the enemy in the battle. And some of the young men, however, were eager to meet the enemy in open combat and press for a direct military encounter. And the Prophet ﷺ agreed to their demands, and accordingly, he divided his army into three separate squads. One squad consisted of the Muhajirin, the migrants, with Mus'ab bin Umair as the standard bearer. Another comprised the Aus tribe with Usaid bin Hudayr as the standard bearer, and the third unit consisted of the Khawarij with Ubab bin Mundhir as the standard bearer. So after the Asr prayer, the Prophet ﷺ set out towards Mount Uhud and inspected his troops at Shaykhayim, and he decided to send back the youths amongst them in desire to keep them safe. However, he later allowed Rafi bin Hadij to stay on, for he was a good archer whose skills would prove useful. And up came Samura bin Jundab, pleading to be retained also. After all, wasn't he stronger than Rafi? And hadn't he thrown Rafi in several wrestling bouts? And Samura begged for a trial bout and made good his claim, so the Prophet ﷺ allowed him to go into battle as well. And at Shaykhayim, the Prophet ﷺ ordered his Maghrib, sunset, and Isha evening prayers. He spent the night there and appointed 50 watchmen to guard the troops. And in the stillness of night, he then departed, going on to Shaut, where he prayed Fajr at dawn. And just as things seemed to be going reasonably smoothly, the hypocrite struck the first blow. Ubaydullah Abdullah bin Ubay chose to rebel against the Prophet ﷺ at this point and withdrew with his 300 companions. And his actions sent Banu Salama and Banu Harith reeling in surprise and dismay. They reacted to the news so badly that they themselves considered retreating. So ultimately, the Prophet ﷺ's counsel and Allah's grace renewed their resolve, but the Muslim army of 1,000 had shrunk by almost a third to 700. And heading this this army, the Prophet ﷺ marched towards Uhud through a short route, leaving the enemy forces in the western part of the area. And he descended into the valley of Mount Uhud, where all the while keeping his back to the mountain. Thus, the enemy stood between Muslims and Medina. And then the Prophet ﷺ drew up his troops for battle on Mount Ainain, which later came to be known as Mount Ramah, and he formed a unit of 50 archers under Abdullah bin Jubair al-Ansari and instructed them to hold back the enemy and guard the backs of the Muslim troops. He stressed that under no circumstances were they to withdraw, and they were to await his instructions regardless of which way the battle went. And the pagans drew up their troops towards the battlefield, marching to the songs and cheers of their women who whipped up their zeal, and moving through the rows and rattling their tambourines. They had sang the song, "If you go ahead, we shall embrace you and spread carpets. If you retreat, we shall take offense and be estranged." And they addressed the standard bearers, reminding them of their duty. "Look, Banu Abdul Dar, O defenders of your generation, strike violently with your swords." So then the fighting begins. So when both armies had drawn near, the standard bearer of the pagans, the most valiant men of the Quraysh, Talha bin Abi Talha Abdari, came towards on his camel and issued a challenge. And he was answered by Zubair bin Awam. And Zubair jumped onto Talha's camel, threw him on the ground, and slew him. Allahu Akbar, cried the Prophet, and all his men echoed the cry. And after the first ritual encounter, the two armies set upon each other. Khalid bin Walid, who was then head of the pagan cavalry, attempted 3 times to reach the rear, and each time he was pushed back by a shower of arrows launched by the Muslim rear guards. And the Muslim soldiers concentrated their attack on the 11 standard bearers of the pagans until they were all wiped out. And as the enemy standard sank to the ground, the Muslim soldiers hurled themselves against the enemy. They charged into the ranks of the enemy forces and slew them in great numbers. 2 Muslims, Abu Dujana and Hamza, fought with great prowess, and their heroic feats on the battlefield were to become legendary in Muslim military history. But tragically, Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib, the Lion of Allah, was martyred in the same battle he had dominated. He was killed by the javelin of Washi bin Harb, an Abyssinian slave, who, with the successful throw, earned his freedom from his master Jubair bin Mutim. And Hamza had killed Jubair's uncle, Toyema bin Adi, in the Battle of Badr, and the grieving Jubair promised Wahshi his freedom in return for Hamza's head. And with his freedom in sight, Washi sat behind a rock awaiting his chance to strike, and as Hamza stood deftly beheading Saba bin Arfat, Washi launched his javelin and pierced Hamza's abdomen and came out between his legs, whereas the Lion of Allah had then fallen. And despite the loss of Hamza, the Muslims managed to overcome the unbelievers who, faced with yet another defeat, began to flee. And the pagan women also scattered as some of the Muslim soldiers gave chase. And some of the Muslim troops set about putting the fallen enemy to the sword and looting the enemy camp. And it was at this point of perceived victory that events began unraveling. The archers who had been entrusted with the safety of their brothers in faith disobeyed the Prophet ﷺ's explicit orders and deserted their stations to join in the looting. And 40 of the rear guards descended the mountains and left the Muslims vulnerable to a comeback attack by the enemy. When Khalid bin Walid saw the sudden vacuum created by the disappearance of the Muslim rear guards, he decided it was time to strike again, and he and his men wiped out the 10 archers guarding the rear, and then they went around the mountain, surprised the Muslims from behind. Now that the Muslims were surrounded, Khalid's cavalrymen raised a war cry and rushed back to retrieve their lost honor. So during the commotion, there was a rumor that the Prophet ﷺ had died, and standing at the rear along the seven of the Ansar and two men from the Muhajirin, the Prophet ﷺ clearly saw Khalid's cavalrymen appear from behind the mountain, and he called out at the top of his voice, "O servants of Allah, come to me." And the pagans who were positioned closer to him heard him call out, and one of the squadrons followed his voice and charged his way to finish him off before help could arrive. And as the enemy approached, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Whoever protects me from them deserves paradise and will be my companion in paradise." And a man from the Ansar heard the Prophet ﷺ's call for help and rushed to shield him at the expense of his own life. And the enemy surged towards the Prophet ﷺ and drew even closer. And the Prophet ﷺ repeated his call, and another of his companions advanced on the enemies and made them retreat at the cost of his life. And one by one, all seven Ansar fell trying to save the Prophet ﷺ. And when the seventh Ansari was slain, only two of the Muhajirin, Talha bin Ubaidullah and Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas, remained with the Prophet ﷺ. And now the pagans directed their main attack at the Prophet. A rock had flew at him, and he fell on his side, and one of his lower right teeth was broken, his lower lip was cut, and his helmet was broken, exposing his head and forehead. And as an enemy soldier thrust his sword at the Prophet ﷺ, he caught his bone below the eye, and the two rings from the Prophet ﷺ's helmet pierced his face. And someone else struck the Prophet ﷺ's shoulder with a blow so powerful that it left him in severe pain for about a month. And luckily, he escaped severe injury because of his double coat of mail. And even as the Ansar and the Muhajirin were risking their own lives to keep the Prophet ﷺ safe, he had incurred injury. Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas unleashed a volley of arrows at the pagans, and the Prophet ﷺ kept supplying him with more arrows from his own quiver, saying encouragingly, "Keep shooting, may my mother and father be sacrificed for you." And there was Talha bin Ubaidullah fighting against the whole band of armies as if he were the only one on the field. And by the end of the battle, he had 35 or 39 injuries. And Talha shielded the Prophet ﷺ from the enemy's arrows and swords with his hands until his fingers bled profusely and were palsied. And as the arrows pierced his fingers, he gasped voluntarily, and the Prophet ﷺ comforted him. "If you had said Bismillah, you have been lifted by the angels before the very eyes of the people." And with human efforts faltering, Allah sent down supernatural allies uh, to the rescue of his Prophet ﷺ. Gabriel, and Michael descended and fought on his behalf, and more Muslims rushed to the Prophet, and they too defended him fiercely. And the first to come to his side was Abu Bakr, along with Abu Ubaid bin Jarrah. And Abu Bakr saw the helmet rings embedded in the Prophet's face and tried to extract them, but it was Abu Ubaid who succeeded in pulling out the metal rings with his teeth, losing two of them in the process. And they advanced together to sustain the severely wounded Talha bin Ubaidullah. So friend and foe alike gravitated towards the Prophet ﷺ, who quite naturally was the focal point of the whole scene. And among the Muslims, Abu Dujana, Musa bin Umair, Omar bin Khattab, and Ali bin Abi Talib flanked the Prophet ﷺ. Even as the pagan soldiers continued to storm around him, their attacks penetrating deeper and deeper, and the Muslims took all possible measures to beat them back. And some of them were shooting arrows, others were putting up defenses, some fighting on fiercely, while others resorted to deflecting arrows with their hands. And the enemy targeted the Muslim standard bearer, Musab bin Umair, and countless swords hacked at his right hand, severing it. And Musab transferred the standard to his left hand, and he upheld the standard on his knee, supported by his breast and neck until his last breath. And since Musab resembled the Prophet to a great extent, his killer, Abdullah bin Kama, thought he had slain the Prophet ﷺ and jubilantly shouted out that he had killed Muhammad. And the news flew around the pagans who, in the surge of complacence, immediately eased the pressure on the Muslims. So the plight of the encircled Muslims continued when the Muslims saw themselves surrounded. They were overtaken by panic and disorder and failed to chalk out a cohesive plan. Some of them escaped to the south and reached Medina, while others fled towards the mountain pass and took refuge in a camp. And some of them ran towards the Prophet ﷺ to protect him from the onslaught of the enemies. as has always been mentioned. And even as the majority of the Muslims stood their ground, their efforts were ineffectually simply because they were disorganized. And disorder prevailed in the Muslim ranks so much that the first row collided with the rear row, and the result was that Yaman, the father of Hudayfa, was killed at the hands of the Muslims themselves. And once the rumor of the Prophet Prophet's death filtered in, the morale plummeted even lower, and grief had stricken and lost. Some of them simply abandoned the field, while others were infused with resolve and rallied, saying, "Come, let us die for what the Prophet ﷺ gave his life." And the crisis receded only when Ka'ab bin Malik caught a glimpse of the Prophet ﷺ making his way to join the besieged Muslims. And Ka'ab recognized the Prophet's eyes through his face was covered with his helmet. He cried loudly, "O Muslims, rejoice! Here is the Prophet ﷺ." And Ka'ab's word had galvanized the remaining Muslims, and they streamed to the Prophet's side. And within a short time, 30 companions assembled around him. And the Prophet decided against further combat, prudently choosing to retreat. And he made his way through the rows and successfully led his troops towards the mountain pass. And the pagans lost 2 of their soldiers in the fruitless effort to stopping them. And by retreating, the Prophet ﷺ managed to save his army from further losses that had come about from simple disobedience of his orders. Disobedience had changed the Muslims' victory into catastrophe, but with Allah's help, the Muslims were pulled back from the precipice. So in the ravine, when the Muslims came out of the siege and holed themselves up in the ravine, some individual skirmishes continued between the Muslims and the pagan soldiers. The pagans chose to engage in small strikes rather than start another large-scale battle, and they would remain in the battlefield for short periods, men and women alike hunting for their fallen Muslim enemies and mutilating them. And Abu Sufyan's wife, Hind bint Utbah, had thirsted for Hamza's blood since she had lost her kinsman to Hamza's sword. When she saw Hamza's body in a gruesome act of vendetta, she cut out his belly, extracted his liver, and chewed it. But as she could not swallow it, she spat it out. And Ubay bin Khalaf made another effort to kill the Prophet ﷺ, but was himself struck down. And the Prophet ﷺ used his lance to unhorse Ubay, who bellowed like a wounded ox as he rode down from his mount. He died at Sarf near Mecca, trying to go back to his lines. And a few more men of the Quraysh came, headed by Abu Sufyan and Khalid bin Walid, and they scaled the mountain at different points to overtake the Muslims at several places. Omar, along with the band of Muhajirin, fought them back and forced them to descend. And according to some sources, Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas shot 3 of their men dead with his arrows. And Abu Sufyan and Khalid bin Walid decided after the last abortive attempt to defeat the Muslims that it was time to return to Mecca. They were satisfied at the damage they had wrought, even though they had lost 22 of their own. They had killed a great number of Muslims. The Muslim body count stood at 70. 41 of the martyrs were from the Khawarij tribe, 24 from Aus, and 4 from the Muhajirin, and a Jew was also killed. And at the Muslim camp, it was time to rest and take stock. And when the Prophet ﷺ finally sat down to rest, Ali fetched water for him to drink from Mehra, a stream in Uhud. The water smelled so unpleasant that the Prophet ﷺ couldn't drink it. However, he washed his face with it, and the rest he poured over his head. And his wound started bleeding again, and Fatima burnt a piece of matting and dressed her mother's wounds with the ashes to stop the bleeding. And Muhammad bin Muslimah fetched fresh water that the Prophet ﷺ drank gratefully. And because of his wounds, he prayed Zohar sitting, and his companions adopted the same posture. So the Muslim men were joined by their women who tended to the injured. Along them were Aisha, Ayman, Sulaim, and Suliyat, who fetched drinking water in leather flask and served it to the wounded. And why don't we do? But I think this is a good place for us to end here, and inshallah, I'll continue the reading in the following week, inshallah, after the reflections of the Battle of Badr, inshallah. Of Uhud, I'm sorry, Battle of Uhud. Allahumma subhanahu wa bihamdi, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.